Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. For the few of you who braved the cold to come out this morning, welcome to the gathering of West Village Church. Yes. Yeah, you guys are going to have to be super, super loud because, this is a... I don't know. I don't even know how to describe this. This is like intimate. This is very intimate. That's a good way to put it. For those of you who are joining us in Theater 2 in the next gathering, thank you for coming out with your kids. I am going to apologize to you in advance because Nathan on the screen tells me I have 40 minutes, and I know I'm not going to be 40 minutes. Today's topic is very, very big, and it's going to be super, super personal for a lot of people, and I want to be able to do as much as I can to do a good job of that, and so it's going to be a little bit longer than what I have, and so just bear with me. I will go through it as quickly as I can, and for those of you joining us online in YouTube land, thank you for that as well. If anyone here is new, I don't think there is anyone, but if you are new, I just want to welcome you. If anyone's joining us new online, and let you know that our heart's desire is to see you move from being a guest with us to being part of our family, and so, new. You know what, Man, this is my bad. Sorry. Thank you, Lindsay. You were like, dude, you even met her. Yes, if you want to get more connected, right below is a number. That's Nathan's personal number, so you can also send him prank calls and stuff. It's very fun. And if you're watching this on the internet, ignore everything I just said. All right, as I said, we're going to be chatting through a topic today that is probably very deeply personal on many levels, actually several topics. Before I get started, there's a couple things I want to say. First of all, I want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have a ton of time here to really go through things and give it the treatment that it probably deserves. And so you're going to hear me touch on things that are going to be deeply personal for a lot of people, and maybe even painful subjects for a lot of people, and maybe things that might actually kind of make you feel offended or just frustrated or even hurt. And I want to just say a couple of things on that. First of all, what I want to say is if you are part of West Village Church, whether you're joining us online or here in the theater, we have always tried to be a church that no matter your background, no matter what you believe, no matter what you think about things, that you can come and feel welcome and be part of our family. And I hope that will continue, even if you're hearing something today and you're like, I don't really know if I agree with you, or I don't really know about your approach to that. I hope that you can still be part of our family and know that this is a place where you're welcome to ask questions, where you're welcome to hold different views and still come and be part of our family. The second thing I would say is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, this passage has implications for some of the hot-button issues of our culture today. Things like gender and sexuality, marriage, divorce, all of these things that are very, again, like I said, deeply personal for people. And I'm just not going to be able to cover everything. So if you want to know a little bit more, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these issues, Chris a couple years ago did a phenomenal sermon series called In His Image. I think maybe there'll be a graphic on the screen behind me. But if you would like to hear a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper into things like I said, like gender, sexuality, marriage, this is a great sermon series, and you can find it on our website under sermons. Just look for that image. Again, really fantastic. The third thing and final thing I want to say before we dive in today is that I want to say that Tim Keller is a pastor that we often quote. He's a writer and a bit of a cultural guru. He has a saying, and I'll just paraphrase it for you. He says, if your God always agrees with you, chances are he's someone that you made up in your head. I just want us to think through that idea for a second. So if God is truly this transcendent, infinite, all-knowing, all-powerful deity, chances are that if we recognize that we are finite, like we literally, if you think about the world in its, magnitude and the universe in its timely magnitude and our little speck of perspective, then it's quite possible, in fact, it's very likely that there are going to be things that we cannot see or understand that God can see and understand. which means there are likely going to be places where we think something should be some way or we think something should look some way, and God actually says, no, you're wrong. And so the chances are, if God always agrees with you, then it might be likely that he's actually not God, but he's a figment of your imagination. He's a little bit of a projection of your own ideals. And so I want to just ask us to enter into this conversation humbly and keep that in mind and be open to even question some of your own held beliefs in this as we continue forward. So we have been going through the book of Matthew together. So if you have your Bibles, feel free to open them up to Matthew chapter 19. We're going to get started right away. As I said, limited amount of time. So it starts off by saying this. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. And large crowds followed him there, and he healed them there. So just really quick, just to kind of bring us up to speed if you haven't been for the last couple weeks, Jesus has been journeying to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is sort of the hotbed of religious and political leadership in Israel. And Jesus has had continual confrontations throughout his ministry, but now he knows he is going for this epic throwdown with the religious establishment, and he's going to be going to the cross. He's told his disciples this is what's going to happen. And he's marching towards Jerusalem, and he has this group of people following him. And yet the religious establishment is not happy with Jesus. And so what happens next should not be any surprise to us. It says in verse 3, some Pharisees came to him to test him. So again, for those of you who've been journeying with us, you know the Pharisees are one of the religious leadership groups in Israel at that time, continually confronting Jesus. So when it says that they come up to test him, that's not a nice way of saying they had some academic quiz for him to go through. This is the author Matthew saying the Pharisees are coming to undermine Jesus' authority with the people that he is leading. They are coming to make him look bad and so that his followers will stop following him. They have an agenda. So they ask him this question. It says, they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? So at this time, there was some religious gurus and they were debating this particular issue and they had different positions on it. And right now, the Pharisees are actually trying to draw Jesus into this debate because they know if he sides with one group, it will isolate people on the other side. But we have to ask, where is this coming from even, like why is this question even around? It's because the religious gurus were looking at the Old Testament scripture and they were starting to draw conclusions about how people should live their everyday life. And this particular question came out of a passage, almost like a little bit of an obscure passage from the book of Deuteronomy chapter 24, which was the law given through Moses. I'll just read to you what this law actually says. You should see it on the screen behind me. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 to 4. It says this, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled, for that would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If you're looking at this, there's probably a lot of questions and maybe a lot of problems you have with what you just read. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem very right. And also, it doesn't really seem to be giving any laws about divorce. It really just seems to be talking about divorce as something that is happening. And yet, as I said, in Jesus' day, there were two groups of thinkers that had really taken this passage and said, no, there are like specific laws that are guaranteeing men's right to divorce their wives. So on one hand, you had a guy named Rabbi Shammai, and Rabbi Shammai was considered the more stringent of the two factions. And so Rabbi Shammai looked at this passage and he said, well, it's clear to me that what this is saying is that if a wife fools around before she gets married, or if she cheats on her husband, man, he's in his rights to divorce her. And he took his cue from that line where it says, if a man marries his wife, a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. So he said, what does that indecency mean? Now, okay, so maybe some of us could be like, okay, that kind of makes sense. I mean, it's weird that it's not talking about the man's part, but we kind of get like cheating is not a good thing. It's something that's going to erode a relationship. But you see, that conversation continued because people kept hypothesizing what indecency meant and kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. So really what it was is just men trying to continue to have power over their wives. And then we come to the more lenient position, which was propagated by a man named Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel took his cue from that first section where it says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him. And so what did Rabbi Hillel say? He said, well, listen, this is what God's saying. God's saying a man has authority to look at his wife, and if she's displeasing to him, he can get rid of her. Now, there's a few wives and women in the room, and I'm guessing you're thinking, that sounds pretty garbagey to me. I just imagine, like, Kevin, you're looking at Beth and you're like, I don't know, you didn't make supper quite warm enough today. Bye-bye. It's not going to fly real well. But this is actually what Rabbi Hillel was propagating in this culture. He literally had sayings that this could mean if a wife burnt the food, the husband could divorce her. And so the Pharisees are coming along and they're saying, well, Jesus, what is it? Is it Rabbi Hillel's position? And of course, there's a lot of people in that society who are like, oh yeah. A lot of dudes who are like, I like the power. Or is it Rabbi Shammai? And even still, there's differences of opinion, but it was totally unthinkable that men would not have power to divorce their wives at their own whim. But look at what Jesus does. I mean, so many times people try and trap him, and yet, man, he does not fall for it. He completely undermines the very premise of what they're saying. Verse 4, Jesus says, haven't you read? Now, let me just remind you for a second who the Pharisees are. These are the Bible geeks. These are the guys who literally spend their entire lives studying the scriptures. So Jesus is about to throw down. When he says, haven't you read, that is like the biggest insult he could say. Hey guys, ever unrolled the scrolls? Ever looked at the Bible? Guys, it's not sounding to me like you have, because if you had, you would know that you're asking all the wrong questions. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. He just looks at the Pharisees and he says, guys, haven't you read your Bibles? Because if you had, you would know you're asking all the wrong questions. You're looking at marriage completely differently than the way that God created it to be. And he takes two passages, one from Genesis 1 and one from Genesis 2, to help them understand what God's true vision for marriage is. Let me just turn there for us and look at them. I think it's worth filling these out. So the first part comes from Genesis chapter 27. Now, here's kind of a little like Bible hint. Whenever Jesus or Paul or any of the New Testament authors, they're quoting from part of the Old Testament, they sort of anticipate that the people who are reading their work are going to understand that that piece is sort of like a hyperlink calling you back to the whole passage. And so they're not saying, hey, just take this one verse. They're saying, hey, this verse is sort of a passage to help you go back and understand that what I'm talking about comes from this entire section. So Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates all the animals, the land, the sky, everything. At the pinnacle of creation, he creates human beings. And it says this in verse 26. Then God said, let us, plural, make mankind in our image. So God, singular, this is important. I know this is going to be a little weird, doing a little grammar lesson, but God, singular, said, let us, plural, make mankind in our image, plural, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So there's this really strange thing that's happening here. God is saying, as a singular God, and I mean, we're Christians, people who were reading this in Jesus' time were Jewish, so they believe like the fundamental truth about God is that God is one. The Shema, like the Jewish prayer that they would say every morning, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And yet right at the very first section of the Bible, there's this weird line where it shows that God is somehow complex, that he can use the pronoun "our" to describe himself. And he says that human beings, you and I, are made in his image and his likeness to bring about his representative rule to the rest of creation. Now listen to what it says in verse 27 when Jesus quotes this line. It says in verse 27, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." And the NIV does a little bit of like a tricky pluralization here that's not actually there. It literally says in the Hebrew, in the image of God, he created him, meaning mankind as a singular entity. Male and female, he created them, plural. Now you may be asking again, why are you doing all this weird grammatical stuff? There's something that the author of Genesis wants us to understand in what it actually means to be an image bearer of God. You see, the Bible makes it clear that God is one, and yet he is three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And these three persons are joined in this beautiful community of love, held together by this covenantal relationship. So Jesus can say, he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I do only what I hear the Father tell me to do. And Jesus can say, I will be with you to the ends of the earth, but who does he send? He sends the Spirit. Now, this may seem weird and complex, but there's something to understand. What God is saying is he's a singular God with three persons and held together in this beautiful, interconnected community of love. And what do we see the result of that love being? That love overflows, and what does it produce? It produces life. It produces creation. Now God looks at humans and he says, I'm making you in my image. And what does that image look like? Mankind, a singular entity. And yet what is mankind made up of? Male and female. Diverse, but brought together, become one. And when they come together, what's the result? Life. They produce life. Now I can hear some objections that you might have. You might be saying to yourself, listen, Andrew, we don't need biology lessons. And really, like every single animal that's like a mammal does the same thing. So I don't know if that's really special. And this is where Genesis chapter 2 comes in, the second part that Jesus quotes from. And I'll start at the end of verse 20 here. But it says this, but for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So Genesis chapter 2 kind of, it's like a honing in of what's going on in Genesis chapter 1, filling it out with some detail. God's created all the creatures, and there's Adam, first human being, the first man, and God's like, well, I think you're incomplete. You're not full. You're not whole. And so it's kind of like a little bit of like a literary like kind of humor here. God sort of brings animals over to Adam in the story. Hey, here's a dog. Is that going to be suitable? No. Dog may be man's best friend, but it's not going to be a good life partner. Bring over the horse. No, definitely not. And so God says, okay, no animal is suitable for you. So the Lord God caused the man to fall asleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So right there, what's Adam saying? He's saying, she is a human being made like me. And then this is where Jesus quotes from. He says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And that's significant. What the author of Genesis is saying, what Jesus is pointing us to, is that there's something dramatically different about a human being that even isn't true for animals that have some kind of lifelong union. Every animal, as any evolutionary biologist will tell you, has this drive to reproduce. That's very true. But there's something unique about a human. That is not the fundamental drive that helps them choose who they're united with in a relationship. You see, the fundamental drive is to honor God and be an image bearer. And so the way that we enter into relationship together is in this covenantal, monogamous relationship that goes even against some of our biological urges. Why? Because it shows the faithfulness of God. So the two leave their father and mother. What happens? They become one flesh. And that's both speaking, in a kind of a physical, sexual sense, but also in a spiritual sense. Jesus is looking at the Pharisees and he says, you guys don't get it. You guys don't get it. The questions you should be asking is not, how can we get out of this thing? The question is, how do we actually live into the great vision that God has for us, that our marriage relationships would be a reflection to the rest of the world of the beauty of who God is and what he is like. Now, if you're looking at the Bible and you're like, well, then why is there this whole divorce part in Deuteronomy if this is God's vision? You're not alone. This is exactly the question that the Pharisees ask. Verse 7, it says, why then, the Pharisees asked him, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now, we just read earlier Deuteronomy chapter 24, 1-4, and I hope that you saw, as I did, that there actually is no command. What's going on in Deuteronomy chapter 24 is that Moses is recognizing that this is a thing that's happening. And so Jesus really calls them out. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Jesus looks at the Pharisees and says, this isn't a command that God gave. This was him mitigating the damage that you were doing to the people around you by your own hardness of hearts. Saying you were acting sinfully. Look at what was happening. I mean, we can take a lot just from that passage. So a man grabs a woman, treats her like a piece of property, discards her. Another man picks her up, and Jesus says, you do not get to go and undignify that woman by just taking her back like some toy that you got tired of and now you want back again. Jesus says, you were a broken people, and God could have destroyed you. But instead, he steps into your brokenness and works with you to soften your hearts. And you're completely missing the point. You're asking all the wrong questions. You're completely perpetuating the problems that Moses was dealing with when he was leading Israel. Jesus continues on and says this, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. There's something here that we need to pick up on in how the laws work in the Bible. You see, a lot of us can read through them and be like, oh, this is just the way that God wants us to live all the time. And Jesus is pointing something out very important for us to understand. That God is such a God of grace, that he actually comes into the midst of our brokenness, and rather than just eradicating the problem, he works to change us from the inside out. And these laws are actually there to do just that. When Moses lived, the people of Israel had come out of a culture of slavery in Egypt. They lived in the ancient Near East where polygamy and patriarchal society were commonplace. They were living out the culture that they lived in the everyday life. And yet, what does God do here in this passage? He's actually helping the Israelites see something very important. And we see this not just in this passage, but in many, where God's starting to change their views from the inside out. And so rather than being able to look at women as a piece of property that you can accumulate, and I think probably all the women are saying, yeah, we're not property that you can accumulate. But that was the reality of that era. What does God do? He says, no, you can't treat women like that. You can't just treat a woman like a piece of property that you can discard at whim and take back at whim. You have to treat her with dignity, love, and respect. And we see this not only in this, but in many other parts. That's why Jesus, earlier in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, he says things like, you have heard it said. He goes back to the law and he says, you have heard it said, don't murder. But if you think that just not murdering is the problem, then you're missing what the law is trying to help shape you to become, which is don't even be angry with someone. Don't even hate someone. Don't commit adultery. But if you think adultery is the only problem, no, because the vision that God has for marriage is one of this covenant faithfulness from one man with one woman in a lifelong relationship of love that demonstrates to the world the covenant faithfulness of God within himself. And so Jesus can say, don't even think about a woman lustfully. And that's why Jesus can say, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. See, each of these laws of the Old Testament was God and his grace accommodating a people whose hearts were hard from him. But as we see the implications of what God calls them to be worked out, we see the transformation that takes place in a culture and society. And this is what Jesus is trying to help us and the Pharisees understand. He's saying, you're asking the wrong questions. You're asking, on what grounds can I get out of this thing? It's like, you shouldn't even be thinking that way. You should be thinking, how does this thing help me image what God is like to the world around me? Now, I want to be really, really upfront here and say there's probably some of you in this room or some of you who are watching online that you just kind of heard that last line and this isn't your story or it just bothers you in some sense, where Jesus says, for I tell you, anyone who divorces and marries divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And there's probably some questions running around in your head. Questions like, hey, I'm divorced and that's not my story. What does that mean for me? What's Jesus saying about me? Or maybe you're asking questions like, hey, that doesn't seem fair. Like, what about abuse? Isn't that a good reason to not be in a relationship with someone? And maybe you're even someone who is thinking about marriage and you're like, whoa, dude, like, what if something goes wrong? How do I get out of that thing? What are you trying to say here to me? And I want to say just a couple of things. First of all, I want us to be able to hear what Jesus is saying and not implant into him things that he's not saying. Jesus is not saying here that if you are in an abusive relationship that you just need to stick it out. That's not what he's saying. If you are in a emotionally, physically abusive or sexually abusive relationship, that you just need to suck it up, princess. Jesus is not condoning those type of relationships. And I want to be clear, if that is your story, that you have every reason to lovingly take some space and not be in that relationship. But I do want to say this. There is something that Jesus is saying. He's saying something significant about the nature of marriage and what it means for a marriage relationship to be truly broken. Rabbi Shammai, the one who seems to be mostly closely aligned with this position, he wasn't really concerned with the question of like, what should a marriage be? He was really asking questions about divorce, but Jesus is concerned with asking the question, what a marriage should be. And I just want to share with you a quote from one of the scholars that I read, a guy named R.T. France, and I think this is helpful for us to understand this. He says this: Jesus' teaching starts rather from the one flesh versus Rabbi Shammai, who started from Deuteronomy chapter 24. It says, from the one flesh of Genesis 2, verse 4. So that it is only because sexual unfaithfulness has already violated the unity of the one flesh that the marriage must be regarded as no longer intact. You see, Shammai was concerned with a man's right to initiate divorce, but Jesus with the formal recognition that the marriage had already been broken by the wife's actions. What's R.T. France saying? He's saying if a marriage is supposed to be a covenantal union, a one flesh reality, then for you to be united with someone else in a one flesh relationship outside of the bounds of marriage means that the marriage is functionally already dead. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if that's the case, the marriage is dead. Now, I want to caution us here, because even if this is your story, we need to remember that Jesus is the God of the resurrection. So this doesn't mean because this has happened to you that your marriage is without hope. In fact, I know that's not true. I have dear friends of mine, and for about a decade, the husband was cheating on his wife, several women behind her back. She finally found out, and as you can imagine, she was devastated. They had a kid together. They had worked in churches together. Their marriage was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Trust was gone. How could they be in one flesh unity when that was completely eroded as a foundation? But God in his grace took the brokenness of that relationship, convicted the husband of his of just the sinfulness in his heart, the things that had led him to act that out in those particular ways, work with him, and brought them back together. After that, they had another daughter, and the name that they gave her was a signifier to the work that God had done. He took what was dead and made it alive again. And so, church, even if your marriage is destroyed and dead through sexual infidelity, for someone cheating, it does not mean that it is out of the hands of God to bring about a resurrection in that marriage. So I continue to invite you, if that is your story, if that is something you experience, not to give up hope. Jesus says you have every right to say this is dead and I can now try this again, but he says also that he's the God of the resurrection and he can breathe new life into it. The final thing I want to say is, it does seem clear to me that what Jesus is saying is there is only one grounds by which someone can faithfully remarry out of a marriage in good conscience, which is sexual infidelity. Now, there's those of you who are have that has not been the case, and you are in new relationships. I have people in my community group, a couple who are both on their second marriage, and I don't believe for either case that the reason that they got divorced was sexual infidelity. There are lots of people in our church, maybe people in this room, who this is the case. I understand this is a complex issue, but there's a couple of things I do want to say. One, I think that if you are remarried, that this isn't saying go and get divorced. I think this is saying that you have a chance now to live a different marriage now that you understand God's purposes behind it. But I also think that there is something to be said for those who have a broken relationship. And that is if our primary goal for our marriage is not about our own personal happiness or personal satisfaction or our personal self-actualization, but if it's actually there to image Jesus, then even in the midst of a broken relationship that we can do that. And just think with me for a second what it says when we stay with a spouse, and not physically stay with a spouse, but do not try and move on to another relationship, but walk it out with someone for years and years and years. It gives a picture of the faithfulness of Jesus, who, in his great love and mercy, though we were faithless as his spouse, the Bible calls the church the bride of Christ. Humans, the creation of God, oftentimes we're referred to as like an unfaithful wife. Though we cheated on him time and time again, though we pursued other things, did he not pursue us? Was there a time where he said, I'm done with you? I'm giving up hope? No, he did not. I understand that this is a very, very, very high calling, and that there are some of you who are looking at this and saying, I don't think I could ever do that. But I want to encourage you, as you continue to wrestle through this, to ask yourself, is this what it looks like for me to picture Jesus even in the brokenness of my relationship? All right, I'm going to move us forward here. We only have a few more minutes left. So, the disciples are hearing what Jesus is saying, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, how can anyone do this? Like, what is the point of getting married if this is how stringent it is? I'm sure some of you in the room are feeling the same way. Listen to what it says in verse 10. The disciple said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to get married at all. You know, there are some people who actually understand before getting married that it's costly, and it is. Anyone who tells you that marriage is like this really beautiful thing and you come together and you have this great romance and then you live happily ever after has actually never been married. Like, seriously. Anyone who's been married for like 2 minutes knows, like Jacob and Karen, you guys got married like what, 8 months ago? I don't know. Yeah. And has it been happily ever after? No. It's hard. It's work. It's like giving up freedom. Suddenly there's this other person who has demand on your life and time and money. It's hard work. And there's people who actually understand that, and they think, okay, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. I'm just going to stay single forever because I like my freedom. Jesus is going to respond to this, and he's going to say, hey, yeah, actually, that's not such a bad idea. What he is not saying is that you should just not get married because it's hard. Jesus is not saying, hey, it's just going to be really hard, it's going to be demanding, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be painful, so just don't do it. And if those are the reasons that you're saying no to marriage, I want to just caution you and say, again, that you have this beautiful opportunity to reform your view of what marriage is, because marriage is not supposed to be something for your own satisfaction, your own fulfillment, your own joy even. Although those things might be byproducts at different times in a marriage, your marriage, as Jesus has just shown us, is there so that you can demonstrate and declare to the world around you what God is like. And that means that it will be costly, because we know what God is like. He's the God who gave up his very life for the ones he loved. Jesus responds, verse 11. He says, yeah, not such a bad idea, but not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it will be given. And then he starts throwing around this word eunuch. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term eunuch. It's not something we use very often unless you watch maybe like Game of Thrones or something like that. It's a pretty old word. I'm going to give you like the 14A version of what a eunuch is. So if there's any kids theater, theater 2, just earplugs. But this is what happened. In ancient cultures and patriarchal societies, men, as we have continually said, accumulated women-like property. Rich men had many women. And what did they not want to happen? They didn't want other dudes sleeping with their women. They didn't want any possible damage to their heritage by some guy coming along and making babies with their ladies. And so they would have guys who had their bits snipped. And those were eunuchs. That is the Andrew's scientific definition of what a eunuch is. So Jesus is using this term, and he's using it broadly to talk about anyone who would not be eligible for a marital relationship. And I want to say one other thing about this. We don't have such a clearly defined correlation between procreation and marriage, but in Jesus' day, it would have been unthinkable that someone else would go into a marriage if they weren't prepared or willing to have kids. And if they weren't able, then they were probably not worth even looking at for a marriage relationship. And so singleness was actually unheard of in Jesus' day. In fact, the same rabbis who were having this argument about what reasons you could divorce your wife would clearly tell the people that if you look at Genesis, it says be fruitful and multiply and increase in number. So if you're a dude, you're not doing your spiritual duty if you're not making babies. That was literally what was being taught. And so you can imagine if you were a single person in this society, you were treated like a second-class citizen, maybe even worse. So to be a eunuch, someone who was incapable, was a great, great, great dishonor. We live in this really strange culture where we kind of have a little bit of both. If you talk to people, kind of just in general, there is this sort of elevation right now of singleness. In fact, it's an increasingly growing reality that more and more people are just choosing not to get married, to stay single. Why? Because we celebrate. Like, what's that image that we have, that kind of cinematic image, like the bachelor who just has his freedom, who can do whatever he wants. He has the sweet bachelor pad with like one side, like all his like video games, the other side, like his sword collection. And then, he has goes out for beers, like every day with his friends, and he's, this is like celebrated. Or like the lady who has this like great career job, and she has like fantastic friends, and they do brunch every Saturday, and she goes and travels around the world. Just complete freedom. And so, in a sense, we have this part of our culture that lifts up singleness and celebrates it, but maybe not for the right reasons. But at the same time, we have a culture that also still largely revolves around families. Think about even like our elections. People are making promises for the middle class, and when they're talking about the middle class, who are they really talking about? They're not talking about middle class, Joe Schmo who's a bachelor and living on his own. They're talking about families. Now, this is even probably more pronounced in the church. And I just want to say this, for those of you who are single in our church family, I want to just say that I recognize that we as a church have not always done a great job to lovingly lift you up. And I want you to hear what Jesus has to say, because I think he will help you understand the rich vision that he has for you as a single person. But I know that we need to do better. We need to do better in our community groups. Sometimes you might be sitting there and you're like, hey, everyone's talking about families and stuff with their kids, and I don't know what this means for me. Here's the reality. Myself, Chris, Matt, Ken, almost everyone is married, has kids, and so this is our reality, and we often speak from that. And at times, we need to take a step back and recognize that that is not everyone's reality, and do a better job of helping you understand the implications for what God has for you in your particular area. And so I want to try and do better at that. And please, if you are single and you have suggestions to help us do this better, please, 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 let us know. So listen to what Jesus says here. Verse 12, he says, "For there are eunuchs who have been born that way." So he says, there are some people who just are born and they can't have kids, for physiological reasons. And here's where I think this is going to get a little bit dicey for us. But I actually think the implications of what Jesus is saying here does not just stop at physiological reasons. I think what Jesus is saying is there are some people who are not wired in such a way that they are going to be brought together in a lifelong heterosexual relationship. I understand in our day and age that that's a very, very, very hard and unpopular thing to hear. And I know that. I'm like looking at the clock. I'm like, I'm already over. I know that I don't have enough time to do justice to this. But what I want you to look at, first of all, is go back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. See the vision for what marriage is to look like. And understand that that actually has implications not just for a marriage relationship, for defining what marriage actually is. And the Bible's definition is a unity built up of diversity, man and woman, that images God. And so Jesus is saying here, that might not be the way that you're wired, and that's okay. That's okay. Marriage is not for you. And then he says, and there are those who are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. So that's what we were talking about earlier, just that people have it forced on them. Slaves have it forced on them so that they can care for the women of rich people. But then he says this, and this is so revolutionary for Jesus' day. And he says, there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept this. Jesus says, there are those of you who are going to choose to forgo the responsibilities of family, of having a spouse, so that you can be freed up to be an image bearer for God's kingdom with your entire life. And Jesus is saying this is a really good thing. In fact, he's saying something almost revolutionary compared to what he just said, because he's just been saying, hey, what's the purpose of marriage? The purpose of marriage is that it's supposed to be an image of what God's like, and he's now saying, but you can even be an image of what God's like as a single person. So you don't have to be married to have a rich and fruitful life for Jesus. Now, I want to recognize, as we're kind of finishing off here, just that there are those of you in the room who are like, okay, Andrew, that's great, but you're married, you have kids. You can tell me singleness is great, and I can have a long and fruitful life serving Jesus, and that's awesome. But yeah, it's really lonely sometimes. It's really hard sometimes. And you don't really get it. You don't know what you're talking about. And I'll say, yeah, you're right. That's not my story. It's not. And I don't want to pretend that I'm going to be able to understand what you're feeling or what you're going through. But I do want to caution you to say you also don't understand what I feel and what I go through as a married person who's a father. In fact, the Apostle Paul actually wrote on this issue, and I just want to read to you what he says, because I think it'll help us a little bit. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 27, he's talking about, should people get married, kind of vamping on what Jesus says here. And he says, are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. He's saying, so, if you want to get married, get married. If you're not married, he's like, be single for the kingdom. Either one is great. He says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Many scholars believe that the Apostle Paul isn't just talking here abstractly. As we know from his history that he was a regular Jewish guy who followed all the laws, which means he was likely married, and yet we never hear him talk about a wife. And scholars hypothesize that that's because when he came to know Jesus, his wife said, I don't want anything to do with you. And he felt acutely the tension of a wife who wasn't able to walk with him in this journey. You will face a tremendous amount of loneliness and pain as a single person at different times, and I understand that, but here's some things that you will never understand, and you'll never have to go through. You'll never have to go through being united with someone so intimately who knows how to rip you apart so viciously. You'll never have to go through watching someone that you love not share the most fundamental part of who you are in a relationship with Jesus. And many people have gone through that who are married. They think they're marrying someone who's a follower of Jesus, and they find out years later that person has strayed or that person has walked away. And now they are so lonely, and that person lies next to them every night. You'll never know the trauma of having a child that you brought into the world go out of it before yourself. And you'll never know the agony of watching as a spouse or a kid that you poured your life into chooses to fall away from Jesus, walk away from Jesus, and you don't know if they'll be with you in eternity. See, there are pains that are worse than loneliness. And God, in his mercy, may actually want to spare you of those. And so as you continue to think through this, I just want to caution you to know that this is not necessarily the worst thing that could happen to you. In fact, that Jesus wants to invite you to see it as an opportunity. So what we see here is that Jesus holds up two ways that we image God. One, in a lifelong covenantal relationship. And two, as a single person. And Jesus says each of these validly has a chance to image what I'm like. But let's be honest, we suck at this. Those of us who are married are terrible. Like this, just the other day, like I made my wife cry. I'm not always a good husband. I'm pretty mean sometimes. And sometimes she doesn't make me cry because I'm, like German heritage dude. Like I don't cry very much. But she knows how to, get me where it hurts. Those of us who are single, we don't always honor God. We don't always declare what he's like in the way that we choose to use our time and our resources and our energy. We are, for all intents and purposes, incapable of doing this. We are like a faithless spouse. And this is where the gospel comes into play. Jesus' invitation to us is to recognize this, to recognize that our hearts are indeed hard, and that we actually need him to come and fulfill the law because we cannot do it on our own, and yet he did. You see, Jesus is the faithful spouse who kept the covenant when we could not. And the only way that we are going to actually be able to image him to the world around us is if we submit ourselves to him and allow him, through his Spirit, to start working us. There's no way you're going to be able to serve your wife or your husband in the way that you are called to unless you first submit yourself to Jesus and allow him to serve you. And out of the overflow of that, out of the overflow of understanding the grace, the mercy, the love, the compassion, the servanthood, are we able then to serve our spouse? And that's why Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 says that the marriage relationship is a picture of Christ with the church, and that's what we're called to, but only when we actually unite ourselves with Christ are we able to live that out. In singleness, we may feel incomplete. We may feel like we can't do this without another person, and yet the invitation of the gospel is to understand that we're not, that we have a husband, we have a spouse who has completed us. You might be single right now, and someday you're going to get married, you're going to find out your spouse doesn't actually complete you. Doesn't actually make your life completely easy and better. But there is someone who can, and his name's Jesus. And his invitation for you is that you come and find your satisfaction in him, and when you do, then you will be able to image him in whatever state you are in. I'm going to finish off here. I know I'm running a little bit late, but I want to just invite you to come and join me now for communion. Communion is this beautiful symbol, and in many ways, it's almost like a marriage symbol. A lot of weddings actually choose to take communion because it's a reminder of this covenantal relationship that we have been invited in, this beautiful community of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that has poured out to us and now invited us in through the work of Jesus. So as you take the cracker, I know it's a little tricky here. You got to peel back the plastic part first, the top. Pull out the little wafer. On the night that Jesus was about to go to the cross, he was sitting with his disciples, and he said, as the bread came around, he took it, and he said, "This is a picture of my body, which is about to be broken for you." He said, "This is the extent that I will go to uphold my covenant love with you, to bring you into relationship with me." He said, "Whenever you take of it, do it in remembrance of me." So let us take the bread and eat it in remembrance of Jesus. The gospel writers write that after Jesus had taken the bread and after the meal was over, and the cup of wine was being passed around, and Jesus took it and he held it up and he said, "This is a picture of the new covenant of my blood." He's saying, at great expense to myself, am I restoring this relationship? Am I reviving what was dead? So whenever you come together, drink it in remembrance of me. So let us drink it in remembrance of our God who was the husband that did not divorce us, but actually pursued us even when we were unfaithful to him. Father, you have called us to be your image bearers, and yet, as we think about it, those of us who have been married, those of us who have been divorced, those of us who have never been married, we have done a very, very bad job of it. And yet there was one human being who did it perfectly, and his name was Jesus. And because he was faithful when we could not be, you have now invited us into a covenantal relationship with you. So Father, just pray out of the outflow of that relationship that you would help us to image you in our relationships, in our singleness, in our marriages, that the world might know what it is to be in relationship with a God who is a covenantal God who loves, loves, loves forever. I pray this in your name.